So by 1916, you have the beginning of the Great Migration, and by 1919, about 500,000 black Americans have left the South for northern cities. And bear in mind that before the Great Migration, Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina were majority black populations, but they have never been majority black since. And by the end of the Great Migration in around 1970, about 6 million people in total have moved to the north. Racial tensions are still high, though, regardless of whether you live in the North or the South. Race riots still occur all throughout the United States. And bear in mind that the liberal position on lynchings at this time is the idea that some lynchings are justified, as opposed to all of them being an unjust form of mob violence. That being said, in 1917, the United States enters into the First World War under Woodrow Wilson. Wilson, a staunch segregationist, also doesn't really want black men in the military because he's concerned about seeing organized black men in uniform with firearms. However, some black communities, like in Harlem and Chicago and in other places as well, see this as an opportunity. If they can demonstrate competency in the battlefield, maybe they will earn the respect of their peers. If they can fight for democracy in Europe, and they can show patriotism in the process, maybe they'll be recognized for that patriotism, and maybe that democracy in Europe will also spread more to the United States. So, they successfully lobby for the creation of two segregated divisions, the 92nd and the 93rd, most notable of them being the 369th Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters. These units were not treated well. The NAACP had to work to help secure them training camps so they could actually receive some degree of military training. They were not allowed to train with weapons often, so they usually just trained with broom handles or whatever they could find instead. And in many ways, once they actually reached the Western Front, they were treated worse than they were in the US. A lot of them were forced to do menial work such as digging ditches, and a lot of them weren't allowed to see the battlefield. William Hayward is the commander of the 369th, and he's frustrated by this, so he tries to find ways to boost the reputation of the regiment. He discovers that their band is extremely talented, so he takes their band on a tour throughout Europe to boost morale and to showcase their musical talents. And it works, it helps get them noticed. Woodrow Wilson has been repeatedly denying requests from the French military to provide soldiers as reinforcements because him and Pershing both really want to keep the United States military a complete unit. However, he doesn't want black soldiers fighting with white soldiers, so he sees this as an opportunity and he lends the French military the 92nd and the 93rd Infantry Divisions. As Wilson sends these soldiers over to the French, he requests that they do not, in his own words, spoil the Negroes, because he's worried that if they see what racial equality looks like, then they will try to advocate for that in the US. And the French largely disregard this. They don't really care. They have dealt with so many losses throughout the war that any help is welcome, and they start to treat the black soldiers as equals. The Harlem Hellfighters end up becoming one of the most decorated units of the First World War, with 170 of them receiving the Croix de Guerre, or the Cross of War, from the French. However, upon their return to the US, they don't really see an improvement of their conditions, nor how they're treated. Veterans return to Washington, D.C. to find out that they can no longer work the jobs that they had before the war because of Jim Crow laws. You have people like Wilbur Little who are lynched in Blakely, Georgia because he refuses to remove his military uniform. In Bisbee, Arizona, white policemen attack black veterans because they refuse to surrender their sidearms for a 4th of July parade that they're supposed to walk in. In Norfolk, Virginia, there's a homecoming celebration that's disrupted by a race riot, and this is what starts what is known as the Red Summer of 1919. The Red Summer of 1919 was marked by racial violence and riots in more than 30 cities in the United States, and it was for multiple reasons. The economy wasn't doing so well after the end of the war. In general, there was more competition for jobs. You had the fact that black veterans were coming back and they were expecting more respect after having fought on the Western Front, which increased violence from people who were trying to preserve the racial hierarchy. There's also the fact that black men were often hired as strikebreakers, which increased tensions between white labor unions. W.B. Du Bois sees this violence, and he famously writes, we return from fighting, we return fighting." And this is where you see a shift from the age of Booker T. Washington, where Booker T. Washington argued that the black man should find a place within white society. Now you have figures such as Hubert Harrison, Marcus Garvey, and Alan Locke, as well as Du Bois, starting the New Negro movement, where as opposed to accommodating white society, they will find their own identity and self-determination, regardless of what white people think. In 1917, Hubert Harrison founds the Liberty League as well as the newspaper The Voice, and he's largely attributed with starting the New Negro movement, a movement of self-determination. And he believes that not only in race consciousness, but also in class consciousness. He believes that race is a concept being used by the classes in order to maintain a racial and social hierarchy which limits economic potential. And he argues this while also being a leading organizer for the Socialist Party of America. Harrison is also deeply anti-religious and critical of Christianity because it is usually used to justify subjugation and racism, writing that in the King James Bible, written as late as 1611, there is no concept of race. Also saying here, show me a population that is deeply religious, and I will show you a servile population, content with whips and chains, contumely and the gibbet, content to eat the bread of sorrow and drink the waters of affliction. There are multiple prominent figures in the New Negro movement, such as Alan Locke, who writes, "The day of aunties, uncles, and mammies is gone. We are achieving something like a spiritual emancipation." So he's arguing that black culture should be embraced as its own thing and not try to become more palatable to white audiences or try to be whatever it is that other people want it to be. Then you have figures like Marcus Garvey, who takes it even further, not only arguing that black people should not bother themselves with Eurocentric beauty standards or try to achieve cultural success in white America, such as, achieving riches and recognition, but he argues for black separatism, even sometimes working with the Ku Klux Klan, where he argues that the United States is a white country and black people should either return to Africa or form their own country within the United States. And in many ways, he also argues against race mixing, which creates tension between mixed race people like Du Bois. Garvey himself was also targeted by a young J. Edgar Hoover, and he would be charged with fraud and then he would be deported to Jamaica. He would later receive a presidential pardon from Joe Biden in January of this year. What's also interesting to note is that during this time, the 1910s and 20s, the greatest supporters of racial equality aren't Republicans, nor are they Democrats. A great deal of them are communists and socialists. For instance, multiple founding members of the NAACP had socialist ties. Hubert Harrison was a socialist because he believed in Eugene V. Debs, who was also largely in favor of racial equality. Harrison would leave the Socialist Party because they started to have segregated meetings in the South, and Eugene V. Debs couldn't really do much to stop that. However, the Communist Party of the U.S. was largely in favor of black self-determination as early as the 1930s, which is not a position that Republicans nor Democrats really held. In 1920, the American Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU, would be founded, which would later take on a great deal of civil rights cases that helped push the cause forward regarding civil rights in the United States. In 1925, there was the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the first black labor union that would be founded in the U.S. as well. However, the 1920s are also known for establishing scientific racism in the U.S., where you have the rise of the eugenics movement, which leads to things like forced sterilization being legalized in the Buck v. Bell decision in 1927. You also have the Immigration Act of 1924, which essentially codifies a racial hierarchy in the U.S. And you also have the growing membership of the Ku Klux Klan, where it grows to about 8 million people. And that leads to things like the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, the Rosewood Massacre of 1923 as well. However, the Harlem Renaissance is also doing a great deal of work in establishing self-determination and a sense of cultural identity with black Americans, establishing a foothold in American culture by celebrating writers such as Alan Locke as well as Zora Neale Hurston, celebrating musicians such as Louis Armstrong and Gladys Bentley, as well as athletes such as Jack Johnson or Joe Louis, which would later help foster a sense of identity, which would help transform the black community later on during the Civil Rights Movement. This would carry on in the 1920s, however, it would be somewhat disrupted with the Great Depression, which I will speak about in my next part.